Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history, the Wichita Mountains region. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We want to know where and when these documented accounts come in. The wind carries memories across the plains of southwestern Oklahoma, in the shadow of the ancient Wichita Mountains, where granite peaks rise like weathered sentinels from the earth. There exists a chronicle so deeply unsettling that many historical records have been sealed, archived, or simply lost to time. What I'm about to share with you comes from documents recovered from abandoned government buildings, fragmented tribal accounts, and journals found buried beneath the floorboards of an old trading post near present-day Fort Sill. In 1840, when Oklahoma was still designated as Indian Territory, the Wichita Mountains stood as silent witnesses to events that would forever haunt this region. The year was pivotal, a time when the Comanche, known as Numunu in their own language and often called Lords of the Plains by settlers and other tribes alike, had reached the zenith of their power in the southern plains. They had secured peace with the southern Cheyenne and Arapaho to their north that very year, freeing them to focus their formidable military prowess elsewhere. The Comanche were not a unified nation, but consisted of several autonomous bands, each with their own territories and leadership. The Buffalo Eaters were the Eastern Katsuteca band that ruled most of what is now western Oklahoma. They were horsemen without equal, warriors of exceptional skill, and possessed a complex spiritual system centered around what they called puha, personal power, that could be obtained from the spirit world. In the cold winter of 1840, a trader named Jebediah Atwater set up a small outpost on the eastern edge of the Wichita Mountains. The outpost was situated in a narrow valley with unusual acoustics, where sounds carried strangely in the wind, sometimes amplified, sometimes swallowed entirely by the surrounding hills. Atwater's journals, recovered some 30 years later, described his first impressions of the place. The valley seems to breathe at night. The air moves in ways unlike any natural wind I've known. The local guides refused to stay past sundown, claiming the mountains themselves listened to our conversations. Atwater had come west from Arkansas with ambitions of establishing trade relations with the various tribal nations in the territory. He brought with him 3 assistants: Solomon Reed, a former military scout; Nathaniel Webb, a young man seeking fortune on the frontier; and Hiram Voss, an interpreter who claimed to speak several tribal languages. What's peculiar about these men is that government records show only Atwater had proper documentation for Indian Territory travel. The others appear in no official capacity. By February 1840, Atwater's trading post had attracted attention from both settlers and tribal traders. His ledgers, partially preserved despite water damage, showed exchanges with Wichita, Kiowa, and occasional Comanche visitors. The first bad entry, however, was made on the 12th of March 1840. Atwater wrote, "Reed returned from the western slope today, visibly shaken, claims to have found something in the high caves. Refuses to elaborate, but has not touched food since return." The sound of distant drums carried through the valley all night. What Solomon Reed found in those caves would set off everything that came after. According to later statements given by Nathaniel Webb to military authorities at Fort Gibson in 1846, Reed had discovered a natural chamber high in the mountains containing unusual markings on the walls and several artifacts of unknown origin. Among these was a stone vessel sealed with what appeared to be beeswax and sinew. Against the warnings of their Wichita guide, Reed brought this vessel back to the trading post. The following week shows a disturbing progression in Atwater's journal. His handwriting, which used to be neat and precise, is getting more and more messy. He says that his men are acting strangely. Voss stands outside at night facing the mountains, mumbling in a language I can't understand. It's not Comanche, not Kiowa, and I've never heard it before. Reed keeps losing weight, and his eyes are sunken. He says he hears voices coming from the vessel. I've locked it away in the storage cellar. A group of Comanches, led by a war chief named Mukuru, came to the trading post in late March. They came not to trade, but specifically to inquire about items removed from the mountains. Atwater's journal entry that day reveals his growing paranoia. The Comanche knew about the vessel without being told. How is this possible? They requested its return to the sacred caves immediately. Mukuru spoke perfect English, though I was told he had never encountered white men before. His eyes never blinked during our entire conversation. I denied having anything from the caves. The delegation left without incident, but Atwater noted an older member of the group, a medicine man he referred to only as the Ancient One, remained behind momentarily, drawing something in the dust outside the trading post before departing. Atwater wrote down the symbol in his journal. It looked like a spiral with 5 lines coming out of it, like spokes. He wrote below it. Voss says this is a warning sign. The number 5 is very important to the Comanche. April brought unseasonable storms to the region. Atwater's journal becomes increasingly difficult to follow as he begins writing entries at all hours, often in the middle of the night. The wind speaks now. Reed can hear it too. Names from long ago, places that no longer exist. The vessel in the cellar emits a low hum that vibrates through the floorboards. Webb attempted to leave yesterday but returned after nightfall, disoriented, claiming the paths kept returning him to the trading post. Distance has become unreliable. On April 17th, 1840, a military patrol from Fort Gibson, led by Lieutenant Cases Montgomery, stopped at the trading post while surveying the region. Montgomery's official report, filed upon his return to the fort, noted the peculiar atmosphere of the outpost and the unwell appearance of the 4 men. He described Atwater as feverish and distracted, Voss as unnaturally calm and watching the mountains constantly, Reed as emaciated and possibly suffering from consumption, and Webb as nervous to the point of constant trembling. Montgomery also reported that, during their overnight stay, he was awakened by a sound like many voices, speaking in whispers that seemed to come from beneath the trading post. When he inquired about it the next morning, Atwater denied hearing anything and quickly changed the subject. The patrol departed the following day, and this would be the last documented outside contact with the trading post for nearly 2 months. Atwater's journal entries for late April become shorter but more disturbing. The Ancient One visits in dreams now. Shows me things beneath the mountains, chambers that should not exist, passages that lead to places not of this world. Voss has begun carving symbols into his forearms, says it keeps the voices out. The vessel's seal is degrading. Something seeps from it, not liquid, not gas, but something between states. On May 3rd, a significant entry appears. Riders on the horizon today. Not military, not settlers. Comanche war party led by Mukuroo. They made no approach but watched the outpost from dawn until dusk before departing. Reed insists we break open the vessel now, claims what's inside will protect us. Webb threatened to destroy it instead. Found him sleepwalking toward the cellar at midnight. Had to physically restrain him. The entries become increasingly fragmented through mid-May. Atwater writes of hearing music without instruments coming from the mountains at night. He describes the air inside the trading post as thick and difficult to breathe, and claims that shadows move independently of their casters. Most disturbing is his description of time becoming slippery, moments stretching into hours, hours condensing into seconds. The last dated entry in Atwater's journal is May 28th, 1840. They are coming tonight. The Ancient One told me, in my dreams, not to harm us, but to contain what we've unleashed. Reed opened the vessel this morning. Nothing inside but dust, nothing visible at least, but the air shimmered around it like heat above a fire. Voss began speaking in that language again, but this time, God help me, I understood every word. We have torn the veil between worlds. The Comanche have kept this contained for generations, their most sacred duty, and we, in our ignorance and greed, have broken the seal. The journal ends there. What happened to Atwater and his men remained unknown until July 1840, when a larger military expedition led by Colonel Matthias Goodnight arrived at the trading post location during a survey of potential sites for a permanent fort in the region. Goodnight's report describes finding the trading post completely abandoned, with no sign of violence or struggle. Personal belongings, trading goods, and supplies remained in place. Food sat on plates, partially consumed. A single set of footprints led from the building toward the mountains, but strangely they were described as unnaturally spaced, as if the person was taking impossibly long strides. The mystery of what happened at Atwater's trading post might have been forgotten entirely if not for events that unfolded 7 years later. In 1847, as white settlement in the region increased, a surveyor named William Densor led a small team to map portions of the Wichita Mountains. Densor wrote down everything he saw in great detail, and in 1902, those notes ended up in the Oklahoma Historical Society archives. On August 14, 1847, Densor's team encountered a small group of Comanche, led by a warrior he identified as Standing Smoke. Through an interpreter, Standing Smoke warned them away from a particular valley on the eastern slope of the mountains, the same location where Atwater's trading post had stood. The structure itself was gone by this time, with no trace of its foundations remaining. According to Densor's notes, Standing Smoke explained that the area was taboo, forbidden ground that the Comanche had been protecting for generations. He spoke of ancient powers that slept beneath the mountains, entities that existed before humans walked the earth. The Comanche's sacred duty was to ensure these powers remained dormant. Standing Smoke referenced the four who had awakened what should not be awakened, and how the tribe had been forced to make a terrible choice to contain the breach. Densor, a man of scientific mindset, dismissed these warnings as superstition. He noted with condescension that Standing Smoke spoke with such conviction that his men clearly believed every word of this primitive fantasy. Against the Comanche's warnings, Densor led his team into the valley the next day to continue their survey. What they found there defies conventional explanation. Densor's field notes, written in his typically precise hand, describe entering the valley around midday under clear skies. The air grew suddenly still, he wrote. No bird sounds, no insect noise. The very atmosphere seemed to press against our skin with unusual density. Tompkins, one of his surveyors, complained of hearing whispers, though none of us were speaking. As they proceeded deeper into the valley, Densor noted an unusual phenomenon. The mountains on either side appeared to shift position when not directly observed. I would take a compass reading of a distinct peak, then look away momentarily, only to find, upon looking back, that the peak had seemingly relocated several degrees from its previous position. The team discovered a circular clearing where vegetation refused to grow. The bare earth was arranged in a perfect circle, approximately 30 feet in diameter. At its center stood a crude stone marker, weathered but clearly fashioned by human hands. Densor noted that the stone bore markings similar to Comanche pictographs, but of a style I have not encountered before, more angular, more precise. Densor wrote that his men started to feel very uncomfortable as the team began to measure and document the site. Palmer developed a sudden nosebleed that would not stop. Tompkins complained of a high-pitched tone that only he could hear. Matthews began speaking rapidly in what he later claimed was not a language he knew. Densor himself said that he felt like he was being watched from all sides at once. The most disturbing account came as the team prepared to leave before sundown. Densor wrote, "As we gathered our equipment, I observed what appeared to be human figures standing motionless among the distant trees and rock formations. Each time I attempted to focus directly on one of these figures, it would no longer be there. Yet in my peripheral vision, they seemed to have moved closer. I counted at least 4 distinct silhouettes. The rational part of my mind suggests these were shadows cast by the setting sun, yet they seemed to move independent of the light's direction." The team hastily departed the valley that night, camped several miles away. Densor said that all 4 men had the same dream. They were standing in the circular clearing while 4 figures approached from the cardinal directions. The figures looked like men, but they moved in ways that seemed wrong and fluid, as if their joints were bending in ways that weren't normal. In the dream, the stone marker at the center of the clearing spoke to them in a voice that Densor described as neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but somehow all of these simultaneously. Palmer's health had gotten worse by the next morning. His nosebleed had stopped, but he complained of intense pain behind his eyes. Tompkins could no longer hear the high-pitched tone, but instead reported periods of total deafness alternating with moments of hypersensitive hearing. Matthews appeared normal, but refused to speak at all. Densor decided to abandon the survey and return to the nearest settlement. They never made it. 3 days later, Densor showed up at the Cache Creek military camp by himself, confused and sick. He couldn't explain what happened to his men or the days that were missing. Dr. Emmanuel Hayward, a military doctor, treated Densor and wrote down what he saw. He said that Densor was having severe sensory problems and was confused about time. Densor kept saying that only a few hours had passed since they left the valley, even though there was proof to the contrary. Densor talked a lot about the 4 who came before and the 4 who opened the way while he was recovering. He drew the same spiral symbol with 5 lines coming out of it that Atwater had copied into his journal 7 years before. Dr. Hayward noted that Densor would sometimes carry on conversations with invisible presences, addressing them by the names Atwater, Reed, Voss, and Webb. Densor got better physically, but people said he had changed his personality for good. He quit his job as a surveyor and spent the rest of his life alone in a small cabin near what is now Medicine Park. Local stories from the early 1850 seconds say that he was obsessed with covering his walls with drawings of the Wichita Mountains from different angles, always with 4 silhouetted figures somewhere in the landscape. Until 1902, no one knew how Atwater's trading post and Densor's experience were connected. That year, historian Ambrose Bierce, who would mysteriously disappear in Mexico 10 years later, found both accounts while looking into settlements on the frontier in Indian Territory. Bierce's unpublished notes make clear links between the 2 events and hint that something important happened in that valley in the spring of 1840. Bierce was able to find military records that showed that in June 1840, between the time Atwater's group went missing and Colonel Goodnight found the abandoned trading post, a large group of Comanche warriors, thought to be more than 200 from different bands, had been seen in the Wichita Mountains. This gathering was strange because it happened outside of the usual times of year when Comanche moved around and involved groups that usually worked alone. The military observers, who stayed far away, said that the Comanche seemed to be holding a big ceremony in a particular valley. For 4 days and nights, the observers noted constant drumming in the light of fires, though the activities themselves were obscured by the terrain. On the 5th day, the gathering broke up quickly, with bands going back to their usual areas. There is no official record of what ritual the Comanche did there. Bierce did find a partial account from Luther Standing Bear, a mixed-blood interpreter who said his father had been at the gathering. This second-hand account says that the ceremony was called the Binding of Shadows and was only done in the worst of situations when certain limits had been crossed. According to Bierce, Standing Bear said that 4 outsiders had opened a door that should have stayed closed and let out beings that lived in the space between moments. These beings could not be killed, but many medicine men working together could bind them through certain rituals that required them to give up their own power, or puja. Standing Bear's account was most disturbing because of how he described the 4 outsiders' final fate. The story says that they hadn't died in the usual way, but had been woven into the binding, becoming part of the seal that would hold what they had let go. He said they were in a state that was neither alive nor dead, but always watching. Did this happen to Atwater and his men? Were they somehow incorporated into a Comanche spiritual ritual to contain forces they had unwittingly unleashed? The historical record offers no definitive answers, only disturbing implications. In 1934, during the construction of a road near the eastern edge of the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge, workers uncovered a small metal box buried approximately 6 feet below the surface. There was a pocket watch, a carved wooden pipe, a small leather-bound book that had gotten too old to read, and a sealed glass vial with what looked like dark sand or dust in it. The items were sent to the University of Oklahoma for analysis. The pocket watch bore the inscription J. Atwater 1838 on its inner case. The pipe was identified as likely belonging to someone of Northern European descent based on its design. The vial's contents were analyzed and found to contain ordinary sand mixed with an unidentified organic compound that the technology of the time could not properly assess. Perhaps most significant was what happened to these artifacts afterward. University records indicate they were placed in storage pending further study, but in 1935, a small fire broke out in the precise section of the building where they were kept. Though quickly contained, The fire destroyed only the box and its contents, despite being surrounded by other highly flammable materials that remained untouched by the flames. The valley itself, whose exact location has been obscured in most historical accounts, is believed to lie somewhere within what is now the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge, established in 1901. The refuge encompasses more than 59,000 acres of ancient mountains and mixed grass prairie. Park rangers and wildlife management personnel have occasionally reported unusual phenomena in certain areas, particularly a section in the eastern portion that somehow never appears consistently on maps drawn by different surveyors. In 1963, Refuge Manager Harold Winters documented a strange occurrence while conducting a routine wildlife survey in a remote valley. His field notes describe entering an area where the air became noticeably still and heavy, and where he experienced a profound sense of being observed from all directions. Winters noted that his compass began rotating continuously, making navigation impossible. Most notably, he reported encountering 4 distinct human silhouettes standing motionless among distant rocks, which he initially assumed were other park personnel, until he realized they never moved, yet seemed to be in different positions each time he looked away and back again. Winters cut his survey short and left the area. In his official report, he described the experience as likely resulting from light and shadow effects combined with isolation fatigue. However, in personal correspondence discovered after his death in 1976, he admitted to colleagues that he continued to have dreams about the 4 figures for years afterward. In these dreams, they would approach him silently, their features never quite visible, and speak in unison without moving their lips. Their message was always the same: we watch, we contain, we endure. What I've shared thus far is merely the foundation of a much deeper mystery, one that stretches back further than the Atwater incident and continues to manifest in ways that defy rational explanation. The Comanche themselves were not the first to recognize the unusual properties of the eastern Wichita Mountains. Archaeological evidence suggests that earlier peoples, possibly ancestors of the Wichita tribe, established seasonal ceremonial sites in specific valleys, always oriented toward certain peaks in a pattern that corresponds to celestial alignments during the winter solstice. These sites date back at least 500 years, and all were deliberately abandoned sometime in the early 1700s, around the same time the Comanche were establishing dominance in the region. Spanish explorers in the late 17th century, led by Diego del Castillo, documented unusual phenomena in the area while searching for rumored gold deposits. Del Castillo's journals, preserved in archives in Mexico City, describe a valley where the compass needle spins without purpose and where men hear voices calling their names, though no speakers are present. He noted that his indigenous guides refused to enter certain ravines, claiming that those who slept there awakened changed, speaking of places that do not exist and times that have not yet come to pass. The Comanche, upon establishing control of the region, quickly identified these same areas as spiritually significant. Unlike many indigenous peoples who built structures or left markers at sacred sites, the Comanche did the opposite. They deliberately obscured these locations, removing signs of human visitation and creating false trails to lead travelers away from them. According to fragments of oral history recorded by ethnographer James Mooney in the 1890 seconds, the Comanche believed that certain places in the Wichita Mountains were thin spots, points where the boundary between the tangible world and the spirit world had worn thin. At these locations, puha was more concentrated, more accessible, but also more dangerous. Only the most experienced medicine men, those who had shown extraordinary spiritual discipline, were allowed to visit these places. Even then, they could only go at certain times based on the stars. What makes the Comanche's relationship with these sites particularly interesting is their departure from typical indigenous sacred site practices. Most tribes mark and honor their holy places, but the Comanche actively concealed theirs. They spread false stories about the locations, deliberately misled outsiders, and established a complex system of guardianship that involved warriors stationed at a distance to intercept travelers who might accidentally approach these areas. This level of secrecy suggests they were not merely protecting sacred ground, but containing something they perceived as genuinely dangerous. When Lieutenant Randolph Marcy led the first official U.S. military expedition through the Wichita Mountains in 1852, he noted in his report that the Comanche guides became increasingly agitated as they approached the eastern range. They insisted on taking circuitous routes that Marcy, consulting his maps, knew were inefficient. When pressed, the guide spoke of shadow people who walk the narrow valleys after sunset, and voices in the stone that could drive men to madness. Marcy, a practical military man, dismissed these as superstitions designed to keep white settlers away from potential mineral deposits. However, he did record in his personal journal, later donated to the University of Texas Archives, that several of his men reported unusually vivid and disturbing dreams while camped near the eastern mountains, dreams of figures watching from the ridgelines, and whispering that seemed to come from within the earth itself. One soldier reportedly woke screaming, claiming he had been speaking with his brother who had died years earlier in the Mexican-American War. The soldier insisted it was not a dream but a visitation, and that his brother had warned him about the old ones who sleep beneath the hills. By the 1,850 as white settlement increased in Indian Territory, reports of strange occurrences in the Wichita Mountains began to appear in regional newspapers and military dispatches. The accounts follow remarkably consistent patterns. Travelers experiencing lost time, where hours or days passed without memory, compasses, and later watches malfunctioning in specific valleys. The persistent feeling of being observed, and most commonly, encounters with what became known locally as the Watchers, human-like figures seen at a distance who never approached but never fully departed. In 1858, a Methodist circuit preacher named Elijah Harmon documented his experience while traveling through the eastern Wichita Mountains. His account, published in a church newsletter and later preserved in the Oklahoma Historical Society archives, describes becoming lost despite following what he believed was a clear trail. As night fell, he made camp in a small valley. Throughout the night, he wrote, I was plagued by a strange heaviness in the air that made breathing difficult and sleep impossible. Though no fire burned within sight besides my own, I continuously glimpsed what appeared to be the shadows of men moving at the periphery of my vision, always watching, never approaching. Most disturbing was the sensation that time itself flowed differently in that place. The stars seemed fixed in the sky for hours, unmoving, as if the very rotation of the earth had slowed. Harmon said that when he finally fell asleep around dawn, he had a dream that was so real that he thought it was real. In this vision, he was approached by 4 men dressed in the fashion of a much earlier era, clothing of the previous century, as he described it. They spoke to him in unison without moving their lips, telling him he had camped on forbidden ground and must leave immediately. They used the same 4 names to identify themselves that would later be linked to the Atwater incident: Jebediah, Solomon, Nathaniel, and Hiram. Harmon awoke to find himself not in the valley where he had made camp, but on an open plain nearly 5 miles away, with no memory of how he had traveled there. His horse was beside him, still saddled, but showing signs of exhaustion as if it had been ridden hard. After the establishment of Fort Sill in 1869, military patrols regularly traversed the Wichita Mountains. The fort's records contained numerous reports of unusual incidents experienced by soldiers in the Eastern Range. These were typically filed as routine patrol logs, but were later collected and separately archived by Captain Arthur Wells, the fort's intelligence officer from 1872 to 1875, who had developed a personal interest in the phenomena. Wells's collection, now housed in the National Archives, includes over 30 separate accounts of anomalous experiences. One of the most detailed comes from Sergeant Tobias Miller, who led a 6-man patrol through the eastern mountains in October 1873. Miller reported that his unit became inexplicably disoriented, despite clear weather and familiar terrain. As evening approached, they made camp in a sheltered valley. During the night, all 6 men reported hearing what sounded like whispered conversations in an unrecognizable language that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. 3 of the men experienced identical nightmares of figures approaching from the shadows. The next morning, they were most upset to find that, even though they had set up a standard watch rotation with each man taking a 2-hour shift, they all thought they had slept at the same time for several hours, leaving the camp unguarded. But nothing was out of place, and their horses didn't seem worried. Quanah Parker, the last war chief of the Quahati Band, and later a main leader of the Comanche during the reservation era, may have been the only thing that kept the Comanche connected to the Wichita Mountains after they were forced to live on reservations in the 1872. Parker himself, half white, the son of Comanche chief Peta Nocona and captured settler Cynthia Ann Parker, straddled both worlds and worked to preserve crucial aspects of Comanche culture while adapting to changing circumstances. Historical records show that Parker often went to the Wichita Mountains with small groups of trusted warriors and medicine men. These trips were technically against the rules on the reservation, but Indian agents who liked Parker let them happen anyway. According to accounts later provided by his grandson Edward Parker in interviews conducted by the University of Oklahoma in the 1952, these expeditions were not nostalgic returns to hunting grounds, but the continuation of an essential duty, maintaining what Quanah called the binding. Edward Parker's story makes it seem like Quanah thought the binding of shadows ritual from 1840 needed to be done again every so often, especially when certain stars were in certain positions. The last documented trip Quanah made to the mountains was in February 1911, just days before his death. He was old and sick, but he insisted on finishing the trip even though the weather was bad. When he got back, his family says he told his wife, "It is finished. The next binding will fall to others in another time." When she asked him what he meant, he is said to have replied, "Only the 4 remain. They hold the door closed, but nothing holds forever against what waits behind it." The opening of the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge in 1901 brought a new dimension to the ongoing mystery as the area became accessible to researchers, naturalists, and later, tourists. Reports of unusual phenomena did not diminish, but rather took on new forms. Dr. Franklin Whitehurst is a geologist who works for the U.S. The Geological Survey did a lot of research on the mountains from 1901 to 1909 and found magnetic anomalies in certain valleys that couldn't be explained by normal means. In his field journals, preserved at the Smithsonian Institution, he noted that sensitive equipment would malfunction in particular locations and that some rock formations exhibited unusual properties, including faint but measurable electromagnetic emissions. Whitehurst was a careful scientist who looked at these strange things with professional doubt, ruling out known causes like mineral deposits with a lot of iron in them. In a letter to a colleague at Yale University in 1907, he wrote, "Having exhausted conventional explanations, I am left with data that suggests localized distortions in what we understand as natural law. Certain valleys within the Eastern Range exhibit properties that, were I a man given to fanciful thinking, I might describe as thin places in the fabric of reality. As I am not such a man, I can only acknowledge that our current scientific understanding is insufficient to explain what I have measured and observed." Whitehurst eventually abandoned his research in the Wichita Mountains, citing professional concerns about pursuing a line of inquiry that might damage his scientific reputation. His final field notes contain a curious entry, "Camped in the Eastern Valley for 3 nights. Each night dreamt of 4 men who identified themselves as former travelers in this region. They speak in unison and insist they have a message of warning. I find myself reluctant to sleep, knowing they wait in my dreams." As more people were able to visit the wildlife refuge in the early 1900s, rangers and staff started to keep informal records of strange things that happened to visitors. These were not officially documented but were collected by Ranger Samuel Thornton, who maintained what staff called the Strange File from 1928 to 1952. This collection, which was saved from being thrown away during an office renovation in the 1962 and is now in private hands, has more than 100 handwritten accounts from visitors describing experiences that follow familiar patterns. Lost time, confusion, equipment failures, and sightings of distant figures that disappear when approached. Dr. Margaret Wilkins, a botanist who went to the refuge in 1936 to study plants, gave one of the most detailed accounts. While working in an eastern valley, she reported that her compass began spinning continuously and her watch stopped. She experienced what she described as a sudden and profound sense of being in two places simultaneously. Physically present in the valley, but also somewhere else entirely, a place with impossible geometry and light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Most disturbing was her encounter with what she initially thought were park rangers watching from a distant ridge. She suddenly understood that there were exactly 4 people there when she raised her hand to greet them. They were all standing very still. It was like looking at a picture that changes when you look away and then back again. They seemed to change position without moving. Wilkins cut her research trip short and did not return to the refuge. In her final report on the region's flora, she omitted any mention of her experience, but included a curious footnote. Certain areas within the Eastern Range proved inaccessible due to conditions beyond the scope of this study. The Wichita Mountains' strange history took a new turn during World War II. In 1942, as part of the war effort, portions of the Eastern Range were temporarily closed to the public for what was officially described as military training exercises. However, declassified documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1,990 seconds revealed that the area was being investigated by a specialized unit of the War Department's Intelligence Division, codenamed Project Lantern. The unit was tasked with investigating phenomena that might have military applications, particularly in the emerging field of psychological warfare. What drew their attention to the Wichita Mountains remains partially redacted in the available documents. But unredacted portions reference persistent localized phenomena reported by reliable military personnel and potential applications for disorientation tactics based on environmental factors. The Project Lantern team established a temporary research station in a valley that corresponds to the location associated with the Atwater incident. According to quarterly reports submitted to the War Department, they conducted a series of experiments involving sensitive detection equipment, photographic surveillance, and what they termed personnel exposure protocols, apparently having researchers spend extended periods in locations with reported phenomena. The project's final report, dated November 1943, remains mostly classified, but unredacted portions indicate that the team documented significant anomalies in temporal perception among test subjects and recurrent reports of visual phenomena consistent with previous accounts from the region. Most notably, the report concludes, while no definitive